Finally, let's talk about being competent communicators. Communication competence has become a focus of higher education over the past couple of decades because it's so important for us to be able to communicate competently. It's such a basic thing. And so let's start off by defining communication competence. To be competent in something means that we know what we're doing. So communication competence refers to the knowledge of effective and appropriate communication patterns and our ability to use and adapt that knowledge to various different contexts. So let's break this definition down a little bit. When we're talking about knowledge, we're talking about whether or not we know how to do something, or whether we understand why things are done in a certain way. When we look at our ability to use this knowledge, we are looking at individual factors like physiological factors and psychological factors that impact whether or not we are able to use that knowledge. And when we talk about adapting to various contexts, we're talking about those individual social and cultural variables that impact our communication. But in addition to these elements, we have these two words, effective and appropriate. In order for communication to be effective, it has to help us to achieve a goal. It has to help us be able to do something. But in order for communication to be appropriate, it has to help us to enhance a relationship. And so in order for communication to be competent, it has to be both effective and appropriate. It has to help us both achieve a goal and enhance the relationship in which the communication is taking place. If the communication only helps us to achieve a goal but doesn't help to enhance the relationship, it's not competent communication. And vice versa, if the communication only helps to enhance a relationship but it doesn't help us to achieve a goal, we're not being competent communicators. And so communication competence involves the knowledge, motivation, and skills in order to communicate well. So we need to know what good communication consists of. We need to have the motivation to reflect on and better our communication. And we need to have the skills to be able to do so. And so we have to work on developing our competence. And as you can see, there's a hierarchy of competence. We start with unconscious incompetence, move up to conscious incompetence, then conscious competence before unconscious competence. So let's break these down. Unconscious competence happens when we are not aware that we are communicating in an incompetent manner. So unconscious incompetence happens before we've built up that knowledge base of communication concepts, and it happens before we've practiced and reflected on our skills in a particular area. So we are being incompetent in our communication, we are not achieving our goals, we're not enhancing our relationships, and we're not aware that we are being incompetent because we don't have the knowledge to recognize that incompetence in that moment. The next stage of developing our competence is conscious incompetence. So this happens when we know what we should be doing, and we realize that we're not doing it as well as we could. So this is when we are being incompetent, but we recognize the fact that we are being incompetent. We have the knowledge to be able to see that incompetence. And this happens once you learn more about communication and you have a vocabulary to identify the concepts, but maybe the skills aren't quite there yet. You aren't quite at the place where you can apply that knowledge. So we are consciously incompetent. We have the knowledge, but we're still communicating in an incompetent manner. Then we move up to unconscious competence, or rather conscious competence, sorry. Conscious competence happens when we know that we are communicating well in a moment, and we take that knowledge and we add it to our knowledge bank that we could potentially draw from in future interactions. So this happens as our skills increase. So now we have the knowledge and we have the skills. We're in an instance of communication and we're saying, okay, I am being a conscious communicator here. I am being a competent communicator here. I know what I'm doing. I know that I'm doing it well, and I'm going to take that knowledge and store it for later. So we have conscious competence. We have the knowledge, we have the skills, we have the motivation. And then finally, we reach unconscious competence. This happens when we communicate successfully without trying, without straining to be competent. So now we are just being conscious all the time. We are communicating successfully, and we're not really thinking about it as much anymore. And we're not always going to be unconscious competent communicators, right? It doesn't mean that we're always going to stay there once we reach the top of that pyramid, so to speak. And this is because we are often faced with new communication encounters that happens regularly. We often find ourselves in new instances where we don't quite know what to say or do. And so we are going to move fluidly through this hierarchy of competence, right? Whenever we reach a new instance of communication, we might be unconsciously incompetent because we didn't know that we were saying something incorrectly. And if we expect ourselves to be perfect communicators after taking a communication class, for example, we're just setting ourselves up for failure. Just because we have that knowledge doesn't mean that we are going to be perfectly unconscious, competent communicators all of the time. What we're looking for, however, is progress, right? We are trying to progress towards conscious communication competence and become more mindful communicators. And as long as we are always progressing in our competence and becoming more conscious of it and becoming more mindful of it, that's how we are being good communicators. It's not by always being unconsciously competent. It's by being mindful and by trying to be competent whenever you are communicating.